These days, it seems like you can't pick up a newspaper, turn on the TV, or open the mail without seeing a story or an advertisement about planning for the proverbial golden years. The expectation of a substantial period of post-employment life constitutes a significant change in the social structure of the United States. Well into the 19th century, life expectancies were low enough that most people died while still in the workforce or soon thereafter. Today, individuals may live for a decade or more after they retire. The critical challenge is how to ensure that retirees have adequate sources of income for their post-employment years. At present, the U.S. retirement system has three main components: Social Security, personal savings, and employer-sponsored retirement plans. Social Security provides retirement benefits as part of a federal anti-poverty program. Social Security was never intended to be the only source of income in retirement. Yet more and more Americans rely almost entirely on Social Security for their income in retirement. In 2015, 34% of households ages 65 or over received 90% or more of their income from Social Security. Personal savings form the second component. However, the U.S. savings rate is generally low. 1/4 of households aged 65 through 74 have nothing saved for retirement. The third component, and the focus of this video, is employer-sponsored retirement plans. For most workers in the United States, their employers play an important role in determining the quality of their post-employment years. Are private and public employers up to the task? Does the U.S. legal and regulatory system provide adequate protection for employees? And what reforms might be considered to improve retirement security in the 21st century? In the 1800s, retirement benefits looked very different than they do today. The first employer-sponsored pensions were commonly described as gratuities that could be taken away by the employer at any point. The gratuity language eventually fell out of favor, but employers retained a great deal of discretion over any plans that they chose to set up. The so-called defined benefit plans typically promised employees a monthly check from the time of retirement until death, and these promises were subject to minimal regulation for much of the 20th century. Starting in the 1950s, news coverage of employees left empty-handed when corporate fortunes went south or when insiders stole from the pension funds helped usher in a movement for pension reform. A decade-long effort culminated in 1974 with the passage of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, or ERISA. ERISA did not require employers to provide any retirement benefits, but for those who did, it established a comprehensive set of rules to govern employer conduct in the administration and funding of defined benefit pension plans. Today, the defined benefit plan has largely disappeared in the private sector. The defined contribution plan has taken its place. In a defined benefit plan, the employer bears the risk of accumulating enough assets to provide the monthly pension checks for as long as the retired employees live. In a defined contribution plan, the employer shifts much of that risk onto individual employees who now bear the risk of accumulating enough assets. Under the typical defined contribution plan, such as the popular 401k, individual employees can elect to contribute part of their current compensation to their retirement accounts. Employers may choose to make certain matching contributions, but they don't have to. Employers oversee the creation of the accounts and the selection of the investment options available to employees. Employees select how to invest the funds in their accounts using the investment options selected by their employers. At retirement, employees are entitled to receive only the amounts that have accumulated in their accounts. Recent research suggests that both employers and employees face challenges with their respective roles. Employees may be ill-prepared to make the required enrollment and investment decisions. Employers, meanwhile, may also lack the expertise and the resources to administer the plans. Consider a small business that makes widgets. While management may have extensive expertise in the making of widgets, they are less likely to have the resources and expertise for the administration of retirement plans. Beyond the issue of expertise, employers may also lack the incentives to maximize the retirement readiness of their employees. Okay, but what about the employer's legal obligations under ERISA? Well, current federal law was largely drafted for the world of defined benefit pensions. Indeed, many of the rules on the books simply don't apply to 401k type plans. Instead, under current law, employer conduct is governed in large part by a legal requirement for employers to act as fiduciaries for the plan participants. When we think of fiduciaries, we typically think of trustees, agents, lawyers, and physicians. We entrust such fiduciaries with great power or property and expect that they will act only in our best interest and with great care and attention. In the context of retirement plan, the application and enforcement of the fiduciary standard for employers is more complicated. The fiduciary standard under ERISA requires that fiduciaries, including employer fiduciaries, must discharge their duties solely in the interest of plan participants. But employers answer to many different constituencies. So in reality, they may have and they may act on interests that do not align with those of plan participants. As I and others have suggested in our research, in a system where private sector employers control access to and the quality of retirement plans for U.S. workers, the current reliance on employer fiduciaries may undermine retirement security. When employers lack the resources to navigate the fiduciary standard and to manage their conflicts of interest, employees may be left with suboptimal plans that offer poor investment options or charge excessive fees. Or employees may not have access to an employer-sponsored plan in the first place. As of 2016, only 66% of private sector workers had access to employer-sponsored retirement plans. Consequently, many individuals are at risk of not having saved enough for retirement. About half of households nearing retirement have no 401k assets at all, and median 401k balances for working households nearing retirement are only enough to provide $600 per month in retirement. For employees in the public sector, the retirement landscape looks quite different. While some public employers have begun to shift employees into defined contribution plans, the majority still offers traditional defined benefit pension plans. But can public employees count on continuing to receive these benefits in their current form? Unlike pension plans in the private sector, state and local plans are virtually free from any federal oversight. That means that the employers, the state and local governments, who make the pension promises are also in charge of putting aside the money to fund such long-term liabilities. The challenge is that in the aggregate, the value of the liabilities for the promised benefits exceeds the value of available assets. As of 2016, state and local governments had, on average, assets to cover 68% of the liabilities. While some public employers have consistently made the actuarially sound contributions to the pension funds, others have habitually skipped or reduced payments into the funds. For example, in 2016, state-sponsored plans received, on average, 92% of the actuarially recommended contributions. Some received 100% or more, but others received just 30%. How can we begin to understand the variation in funding patterns? And what are the implications for public employees? Making promises is the easy part. Setting aside the money is much harder. Individual states approach this challenge in different ways for each public pension plan. Empirical research reveals extensive variation in state efforts to constrain the temptation to promise now and pay later. For example, the state law for some plans provides that annual contributions will be determined by an actuarial formula with relatively limited legislative involvement to approve the payment. State law for other plans provide that legislators shall determine the amount of each annual contribution. An empirical analysis of plan data from 2001 to 2010 suggests that greater constraints on legislative control over annual funding decisions have been associated with better funding discipline. So too have legal arrangements that foster transparency about the extent of unfunded liabilities. As public employers confront the funding challenges, individual employees and retirees face the risk that employers will seek to scale back the benefits. Under the current legal regime, pension benefits are generally treated as contracts between states and their employees. But the precise scope of any permissible changes depends on the idiosyncratic combination of the constitutional and statutory provisions and case law in any given jurisdiction. And so, while most public employees still have access to defined benefit plans, they have limited control over their employer's funding practices and bear the risk that their pension benefits will be reduced or, in some cases, even eliminated entirely. At a time when the very nature of work is rapidly changing, it's important to reassess the current U.S. approach to retirement security. While the current system does have some strengths, in recent years, scholars and policymakers have advanced many different proposals to improve retirement security in the United States. Some advocate for greater regulation of permissible investments for private sector plans. Some seek mandatory contributions by employers and employees. Others advocate a shift of fiduciary responsibility away from private sector employers to third-party service providers. In the public sphere, some proposals call for stronger fiscal constitutions to ensure the funding of promised pension benefits. Others call for the transfer of public pension liabilities to private insurance companies. Meanwhile, state governments have made serious efforts in designing new state-administered plans to cover private sector employees without access to employer-sponsored plans. Across all of the different proposals, the role of individual employers in the provision and administration of retirement benefits has come under heightened scrutiny. The direction of future reform hinges on the extent to which retirement benefits remain tethered to employment and the role of individual employers in such arrangements. Decades ago, when President Ford signed the historic ERISA legislation, he stated that it is essential to bring some order and humanity into the swelter of different and sometimes inequitable retirement plans. Much progress has been made towards this goal, but much work remains in the pursuit of a retirement system that's more equitable, more orderly, and more secure for generations ahead.